Oh, wow, that's loud. Okay, thank you very much. Colleagues, our chair has vacated to go to another meeting, and it falls upon me as one of the vice chairs to chair this session of the committee. And if we could have a bit of hush. Thank you very much. In this session, we will be having an exchange of views with the Commission, with DG Grow and DG Envy on the findings of the fitness check of the most relevant chemicals legislation, which would include REACH and the identified challenges, gaps and weaknesses. And we'll have an opportunity to have a Q&A session with the two representatives from the Commission who are here today. I'm going to give the Commission, I give 10 minutes to both, or 10 minutes in total? Okay, so if I give 10 minutes to the Commission, that's 5 minutes each, please. First, I will give the floor to Mr. Pettinelli of DG Grow, and then to Mr. Sadauskas of DG Envy. So please, Mr. Pettinelli.
Yes, thank you, Chair, honourable members. The European Union started to work on hazardous chemicals 50 years ago. Action at the EU level in the area of chemicals has been driven by its commitment to ensure a high level of protection of human health and the environment, as well as an efficiently functioning of the internal market. The current legal framework covers chemicals in industrial activities, occupational settings, consumer products, pesticides, fertilizers, waste and water, from the moment they are produced to when they are used and after their release into the environment. The fitness check answered to the following three questions. What has the European Union achieved in the area of chemicals? How do more than 40 directives and regulations that each contains one or more provisions on chemicals fit and perform together? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the EU chemicals legislation? Our assessment covers all the steps of the decision-making process at the European level, from hazard identification to decision on risk management measures. We also looked at the implementation and enforcement of the rules by Member States. This fitness check complements the evaluation of the REACH legislation that was published last year. Together, these two evaluations cover the entire EU chemical legislation. The fitness check concludes that overall, the EU chemical legislation is fit for dealing with the complexity of chemical hazards and risks. It reflects 50 years of continuous efforts, strong commitment and progress. The EU added value in the area of chemicals is clearly high. Our chemicals policy and our decision-making process are a source of inspiration for many countries outside of Europe. Decision-making at EU level, harmonization and common standards ensure an equal level of protection of human health and the environment across the European Union. That has also strengthened the internal market and increased the overall efficiency via sharing knowledge and resources. But we did identify some scope for improvement when it comes to the availability of resources for implementation and enforcement of the legislation, and to our capacity to cooperate. Regarding articles imported into the European Union, public authorities struggle with ensuring both overall consumer protection and fair competition between EU and non-EU companies. This includes online sales. The share of products sold online is constantly increasing. A lot of them are coming from abroad. Economic actors cannot guarantee that products sold via their online platform do not contain non-authorized hazardous chemicals. Essential hazard and safety information is also often incomplete or even missing. The level of compliance with the rules depends on whether economic actors understand them and whether they are able to keep with the change in legislation. Clarity of the rules facilitate and increase compliance. This is especially important for smaller economic actors who usually struggle more in this regard because of resource constraints. there are still some inefficiencies in the assessment of hazards and risk carried out by the EU scientific agencies. Additional efficiency gains could result from assessing hazardous chemicals in groups rather than individually and in isolated contexts. European companies will face challenge due to the globalization and the strong growth in the production of chemical outside Europe. Other challenges will come from rapid technological change like digitalization and increased focus on sustainability. The fast-evolving geopolitical and economic context will challenge Europe's current global leadership on sustainability and sound management of chemicals and waste. To face this challenge, we can build on the high level of technological development of the chemicals industry and its skilled and talented workforce. We can build on the internal market that is one of the biggest markets in the world. It protects consumers across the EU and allows them to make informed choice. EU citizens in general have much greater confidence in the chemical safety of products manufactured in the EU compared to those imported. And we can make much better use of smart technologies. They will allow us to continue to take appropriate decisions. They will also improve the way we communicate information to consumers and economic actors across value chains, and they can improve enforcement and market surveillance. And after these views, I'll give the floor to my colleague Kestutis. Please, Kestutis.
Thank you, Carlo. In terms of protection of health and environment, this evaluation shows that EU chemicals legislation has led to many notable achievements. For instance, exposures of citizens and the environment to heavy metals, asbestos, polychlorinated biphenyls, benzene have been significantly reduced. At the same time, we have a number of very worrying growing trends, such as insect and bird population have been declining dramatically up to 50% in some instances over the last several decades. Male fertility problems are growing at an alarming rate in Europe. The incident rate of certain types of cancer and neurological diseases continue to increase among our citizens. All these trends have multiple causal factors. Chemicals are known, or at least are strongly suspected, to contribute to these adverse effects. Our evaluation tells us clearly what are the main policy challenges to be addressed. One is consistency of regulatory measures, which is paramount to guarantee an adequate level of protection, in particular for vulnerable groups. The lack of a horizontal approach can lead to uneven protection for the same vulnerable group between different pieces of legislation. For example, on endocrine disruptors, where right now we have a targeted cross-cutting fitness check ongoing, and it will allow identify gaps, inconsistencies, or synergies. Two, the identification and management of emerging risks, and that requires specific attention. It could be supported by a European early warning system to identify and alert decision makers on time about emerging risks. Three, the current state of knowledge about exposure to hazardous chemicals and their impact on health and environment needs to be improved. We need more data on hazardous chemicals, their uses, their fate, and exposure. Four, better information and tracking of hazardous substances in articles is required. This is also needed for the circular economy. And five, we do not have evidence that the current legislation has driven the substitution of hazardous chemicals at a significant rate. So stronger support to green chemistry will be critical to the sustainability and competitiveness of EU chemicals industry in the future. As Carlo Pettinelli has said, the EU chemicals legislation has proven to be most probably the most ambitious and effective in the world. It guarantees a high level of protection to citizens and environment, and we should be proud of it. But challenges are still many. They are linked to fundamental global economic, societal, and environmental issues. In June, Commission organized a high-level conference to discuss the future of the chemicals policy, and together with the findings of the fitness check of the last year's REACH review, very useful inputs received by various stakeholders will feed into a more general reflection on the future of chemicals policy. The President-elect of the European Commission has already outlined within her priorities the need to tackle hazardous chemicals and endocrine disruptors as part of broad ambition towards a zero pollution Europe. The next Commission has thus a strong basis to define its vision and objectives for the future of European Union's chemicals policy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have three indications so far, so keep those. Okay, we have many indications. I'm going to go first to Peter, you first.
Yeah, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you very much to the Commission. REACH and the implementation of REACH is important in order to protect citizens against dangerous substances. And let me emphasize that it's important that the EU addresses such matters, so it's not done at a national level. The chemical industry was not enthusiastic about REACH, just to say it in polite terms. But if you discuss this now with the representatives of the sector, is that the most important thing about Brexit is that REACH will continue to apply in the UK, that they don't have an individual system with all of the problems with having different production procedures and different regulations. So that's why it's important to have uniform legislation within the single market. At the same time, it's important, and the Commission indicated this as well, that this should not be addressed in an absolutist fashion. In other words, you have to look at the overall impact. And if a substance during the production procedure is used, it doesn't necessarily mean it's dangerous to humans, and that has to be prohibited. I can give two examples with which I've had a lot of experience, and the Commission is aware of this, that we have problems with it. The first situation with chrome, and we had a very close debate on that in Parliament. Some people wanted to prohibit a certain form of chrome. However, there was no danger to the consumer. It was just used in production and was not dangerous if used correctly. If we had a prohibition of this in Europe, then we would have to have the products imported from third countries. And so this is, of course, not better for the environment because the regulations aren't that strict abroad. If the second situation is microplastics, if we have a prohibition, this could have significant impacts. For example, we're talking about artificial grass. The alternatives could be very dangerous for the athletes. They could have additional injuries. So we can't make it impossible to enjoy sports just because of our chemical legislation. So we need to have long transitional periods. We have to have innovative technology. And so I'd like to request the Commission that they look at this in a balanced way and not just say, well, if this substance is dangerous in one situation, it has to be prohibited. You have to look at this in the overall perspective and see what kinds of alternatives are available. That's included in REACH, and I think we should continue to pursue that principle.
Ms. Hazekamp.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Dank aan de Europese...
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank the Commission for that information. A thorough upgrading of the legislation is vital. We need a proper overstructure. Now, of course, if chemicals are dangerous to infants in milk bottles, they must also be banned from toys. What about cocktails of chemicals? You have thousands of people dying early every year. That's quite unacceptable. We have to be more ambitious and take a more urgent approach in banning chemicals right across the board in legislation. Our party is just as forthright in wanting to ban tests on animals. In risk assessment, you can have a cleaner circular economy, if you do without these dangerous substances, if we allow them to continue, we're losing a whole generation's worth of health. Listen to objective scientists and leave the chemical lobby outside the room. As the expert has said, there is no proper balance, and that has to stop.
Dank u wel. Crystal Schaldemose, please.
Mange tak for det.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for putting this topic on the agenda. It's very important to discuss our chemical legislation within the EU. And I also think that it's important, just like we heard, that there is a need for having stricter legislation and better chemical legislation. I don't know if it's reached even that we're discussing right now, because we have to be faster to react, even when we're talking about individual substances when there's a problem. And if we run the risk of having some member states making individual prohibitions, I understand that they would do so if there's dangerous substance. For example, the new Danish government has decided to prohibit fluorine substances in baking paper and baking parchment, because we know there are some chemicals there that can then be transferred to food. So there is a need to react quickly. And if the EU doesn't react quickly, then the member states react quickly. And I think we need a fast track for some of these substances. So when we have studies that show that there is a risk for human health, then we should be able to react now, not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now, now. So I think it's important to make sure that the individual member states aren't having to react more quickly, and then we distort the single market. So I think we should have the best protection throughout the world, but even though it's not always good enough, and I think there's room for improvement. So I think it's very important that it's significant to include this in the upcoming Commission program. We need a new approach to chemical policy so we can react faster when we see individual substances that are dangerous, especially if these are substances that have contact to citizens in their daily life. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Rees.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Nous disposons clairement.
Thank you, Chairman. Let's be clear about this. We clearly have the best legislation on chemicals, as has been mentioned by the Commission representative. I think we can quite rightly feel shared pride in this. There are points of friction with the outgoing Commission, though. We talked about endocrine disruptors. I'm delighted to hear the Commission representative say that quality stock taking is underway. If you look at what happened with the renewal of the authorization of glyphosate, for example, and our demands on pesticide following the work of our special committee, nonetheless, I want to speak on behalf of my colleague, Mr. Rusick, who can't join us this morning and apologizes for his absence. I want to share his questions in English.
That some materials, including plastics, which come in contact with our food, may contain substances which are carcinogenic, endocrine disruptors, or of other concerns. When will the Commission finally deliver a comprehensive and ambitious legislative proposal amending the food contact material regulation to tackle this pressing issue? I've heard, well, my colleague has heard, that a proposal will be published for 2020. Could you please confirm it? Second question, poor implementation by the member states has been identified by the Commission as a major barrier for achieving the goals of chemical and product legislation concerning toys, for example, this has been said before, or cosmetics to protect against harmful chemicals. How has the Commission tackled these implementation deficits? And last question, This fitness check shows that despite the robustness of our legislation, there is no shift towards less dangerous chemicals. According to the final report, in 2016, around 60% of the total production of chemicals classified as hazardous for the environment and around 40% for health. This excessive exposure to mix of chemicals account for thousands of premature deaths in Europe and biodiversity loss. What has the Commission done to reverse this trend? Merci beaucoup.
Merci bien. Normally, we obviously have a long list of questioners, and then we have the Commission respond at the end. The list is relatively short for this round, so I'm going to... there's a few more names. There's 3 more colleagues who wish to ask questions. But I want, because there's a lot of detail in these questions, I want to ensure that the answers are given. So after, we're running ahead of schedule, so we'll have the opportunity to hear back from the Commission after the next 3 questioners, and then we'll have the opportunity to have more colleagues come in. So if I could now ask Ms. Paulus, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the work on these refits. You really put in a lot of scrutiny and expert knowledge in the report. I don't know who of you has had a look at this document. Actually, you did 4 years of study in order to find out we need more data, especially on hazardous chemicals and endocrine disruptors, which affect human health and also biodiversity. You found out that the precautionary principle is addressed but not extensively applied. You found out that substances of high concern are present in everyday articles, affecting consumer health and also hampering circular economy, which has already been pointed out. That pesticides stay on the market because the member states surpass the deadlines which were promised to the suppliers, and many issues more about combination effects, about consistency of actions to protect vulnerable population groups, and so on. And so I'm a bit surprised on the conclusions or the action plans, because I didn't find any. I couldn't find a vision for a sustainable chemical legislation, actually, which really addresses human health and preservation of natural resources, which are the base of a survival, because those seem to be less important than the common market, which I find a bit disturbing. And also, you have addressed missing scientific knowledge. And my question is, what action will be taken on that? Also, there's still no outline for a non-toxic environment, and I think the strategy should have been presented by the Commission in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, and I would be interested to know when we can expect this. And lastly, could you elaborate a bit on the zero pollution strategy, which Ms. von der Leyen has promised, and you have mentioned it, and you certainly have a plan for it, don't you? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Novak.
Hvala za besedo.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've spoken with many people who work in agriculture, and they have all guaranteed me that they are very satisfied with the legislation. When it comes to phytopharmaceuticals, they have received trainings, further education, and traceability has been improved. Those are the pluses. However, there are also some negative aspects, especially when it comes to managing wastes and storing wastes. There is no unified classification for that, and there are different measurement units used. Sometimes it's kilograms, sometimes it's tons, and then on the other hand, we are measuring in cubic meters and liters. It is not unified. I would like to ask the Commission whether you have foreseen some new actions in the field of managing waste and storing waste. Will there be a more unified classification for these items? Thank you.
Jutta Land.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Commission. I have a few questions for you. I think my colleague treated you gentle, and I think I will be the bad cop here today. because I'm actually disappointed. From looking at the fineness in the fitness check, you can only get the impression that things are working well. You get the impression that, okay, some problems, but in general, we have a very good regulation here. And they state, you state that the chemicals legislation is fit for purpose, delivers a high level of protection for people and the environment. But let's face it, that's not the situation here. We see that we have a rise in Europe of very serious diseases, and we see a link to chemicals. And so my question is very easy for you to answer. If everything is working so well, how does the Commission explain that the diseases linked to the exposure of chemicals are in rise in Europe? We see this not at least with the endocrine disrupting chemicals and their effect on the public health. And that brings me to my second question. Why is the Commission not acting to expand the protection against endocrine disruptors so that all sectors in society is covered, such as plastic, textiles, drinking water, cosmetics? We know that people are not protected today, and it harms their health. We want to see more action from you. And I also have a question of compliance. According to a recent study by the German Federal Institute of Risk Assessment and the German Environment Agency, a third of the high production volume chemicals made or imported to Europe since 2010 break EU laws designed to protect public and the environment from harmful exposure. Just 31% were declared as legally compliant, with the rest needing more investigation. And the REACH regulation obliges companies to report to ECHA whether their substances are causing cancer, neurotoxic, mutagenic, bioaccumulative, or harmful to children or human fertility. So why is it that the Commission is authorizing substances although the required information is missing? And my last question, finally. The S&D Group wants to know when the Commission intends to present a long overdue EU strategy for non-toxic environment. People have the right not to be exposed of dangerous chemicals. It is easy to talk the talk, but we need you to actually also walk the walk and deliver, because we need to strengthen the protection for Europe's citizens and environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very conscious that we've had a lot of detail in the questions, and I want to make sure that the questions that have been asked get a proper answer. Not saying that you wouldn't give a proper answer, but what does happen a lot in these sessions is that we have a long list of questions with a lot of detail and then only a short period at the end for the Commission to answer. As we are running ahead of schedule, I'd like to invite the Commission to respond to the questions that have been put so far. I'm aware of additional speakers for the next round. I will give priority to new speakers in the next round, but if you have asked a question and you feel that your question hasn't been fully answered, please do raise your hand again to have the opportunity to seek an answer for the second time. Mr. Pettinelli and Mr. Sadauskas, I'm going to propose 10 minutes to answer what we've heard so far between you, if that's acceptable to you, and then we'll go back for more questions from my colleagues. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Concerning the consideration of Mr. Lees, I would like to say that this is exactly the functioning of the REACH regulation. The REACH regulation tries to take in account all the aspects, and for this reason in the HECA agency there are two committees. There is the Risk Assessment Committee and the other committee, the SEAC, that assess the social and economic impact. After these committees, they draw the conclusion, and the Commission take the decision based on all this information. So the economic and societal aspects are taken into account, and we try to find the better balance. Of course, sometimes the better balance is something that is rather subjective, because what is the better balance for someone is not for others. And we see also before the summer, for for some opinion on chromates, because chromates has been mentioned, that there are several, there are different views also in the Parliament. Concerning the enforcement. Enforcement, of course, is a challenge because the regulation is very complex and the players are very different. There are big companies and SMEs, and most of enforcement is for member states because they have the authority for enforcing rules. So what we are trying at European level, we are making our rules clearer and simpler. We try to avoid duplication and effort when we assess the hazard and risk of substances or when companies need to generate data for such assessments that could improve the implementation and enforcement. The new president-elect in her political agenda has announced the intention to focus on tighter enforcement. So she says that Europe will always fight for a level playing field and will be strong against those who compete by dumping the regulation or subsiding. This is for the external trade. So we will need now to give a follow-up to this political aspiration. As you know, the process for setting up the new commission is still in the preparatory phase, so we cannot give detailed information simply because these do not exist, not because we don't want to give information, but the work is ongoing and there is already a commitment from the President. About food contact materials, there is some work that is already ongoing. There is an evaluation study that is ongoing, and this evaluation will look also on how to address the issue in a coherent way that can assure an even more protection to consumers. But we should say that for food contact materials, there is already a very demanding regulation that already give a high level of protection. Of course, maybe we can do better, and we are, for this reason, we are making an evaluation, but we are not starting from the scratch. And there is also another study, independent external study on this matter that will be finalized soon, and when finalized, it will be published. Concerning the compliance and the German study that has been published on the media, yes, this is a concern. Of course, this is also related to the availability of resources because the number of files that have been submitted is extremely high. So the European Chemicals Agency is obliged to work by sampling. But of course, we have taken the result of this study very seriously. So now the agency is preparing an action plan. The action plan, I think, is quite ready. And we will start as soon as possible with the implementation for further improving the assessment of files that are submitted for the agency. And for the other questions, I let my colleague Gestutis to answer.
Thank you, Carlo. And as regards the animal testing, I think there is an equivocal commitment by European Union, as well as the legal requirements, to reduce animal testing, which is still happening because we don't have always fully functional alternative methods, but those methods are increasing. Animal testing in principle is going downwards, but there will be an opportunity to discuss it once we have produced in the next months the report of Laboratory Animals Directive. This is where we will be showing what the progress is and what the challenges are. As regards to the question why Commission and European Union is not acting faster, and the fluorinated substances have been given as example, it's the right example. Indeed, this is what fitness check has found, is that efficiency can really be improved in the action, and in some cases it does take a long time to come to the final decision, for good reason, because we have to analyze the situation, we have to analyze economic situation, socioeconomic analysis also needed, gather lots of data before we proceed with the action. This is what we call the better regulation as well. But that's why in the fitness check we have addressed this issue, and we in a way hinted that perhaps acting through the groups of substances rather than one by one could be one way to do it. And in fact, fluorinated substance is one example, because right now we have restricted several dozen of them, but there are thousands of fluorinated substances. So going after a bigger group through the so-called grouping approach would allow us to act fast and with less cost and to do it really more efficiently. As for the substitution, what has been done for by the Commission to reverse the trend, indeed, this is the same, or let's say similar finding that we have observed also under the REACH evaluation. In fact, the numbers are reducing, while it may be a bit misleading outlook that the numbers of hazardous chemicals are on the market is so high. In fact, a lot more chemicals have been classified as hazardous because we have analyzed them and there is a consensus that they are hazardous, which was not case before. As soon as they're classified as such, then there are risk management measures that set in, and this is when the reduction of the exposure to such hazardous substances is kicking in. So this is the process. This is how the whole construct of the chemicals legislation is done and is aimed indeed at reducing the exposure to dangerous substances. Then there was a question, why no action if there are so many issues and problems identified in the fitness check? The purpose of the fitness check was to identify issues, to really cut across and look across more than 40 pieces of law and to see are there issues, and there are issues. These have been identified, but the exercise of the fitness check is not to propose actions, it's to identify the issues, it's really to do the check. The actions are to be outlined in the next phase, and this is for the next Commission to be done. This is what we are waiting as eagerly as you are to see what is the program of the next Commission, what are the precise ideas by the Commissions. That's why, as Carlo Pedinelli said, we cannot say more than we have said right now, because we need to wait for the new Commission to come in. But as for the question on non-toxic environment strategy, this is a requirement under the 7th Environmental Action Programme, which, by the way, is still valid until next year. So we still have time to do it. But the trouble with the non-toxic environment strategy is that as it was designed to develop the non-toxic environment strategy, was meant to deal with 4 issues: with nanomaterials, with endocrines, with substances and radicals, with mixtures. And all these are pertinent issues where there is work ongoing in each and every field of them. But as you can see from the fitness check, and if you also remember, or if you had the chance to take a look at the REACH review, as well as many other evaluations and fitness checks that are ongoing or have been finished or will soon be finished, there is a lot more than these 4 issues. And that's why most probably we'll have to have a more far-reaching, or let's say wider outlook and the policy action on this than what the non-toxic environment strategy calls for. But again, this is for the next Commission to say. And this is a possibility that under the zero pollution ambition that has been announced by von der Leyen, these actions will be found there. And I would probably just add to what Carlos said on the compliance with the REACH and the substances that are in compliance with it. Indeed, the action plan is already there, is agreed with the European Chemicals Agency. We are also amending the annexes and the REACH itself through implementing acts, where we will be increasing the checks on the substances 4 times. So there will be heavier scrutiny, and there will be a clarification, legal clarification, by when companies have to improve and update their dossiers in which they characterize the chemicals that they put on the market. That will really improve the compliance with the REACH legislation and will improve also the protection of citizens and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for keeping very succinctly to time. I think you've given a range of answers there that were actually relatively comprehensive for the time that you've been given. But I'm aware that obviously some of the finer points of the questions that my colleagues have asked, they may want to come back on. I've got 2 speakers for the next round if colleagues who have asked the question wish to ask for clarification, please do indicate. First, Miriam Dali.
Thank you, Chair. I will look at it from a different point of view because I do understand that new forms of industrial cooperation between chemicals industries and other industries are emerging and that they are shaping new industrial structures, but we still lack proper emphasis on policies that then facilitate structural change in the chemical sector that truly address environmental health and societal challenges. And we need a chemicals industry that is a strong driver of resource and energy efficiency and that also contributes to the decarbonisation through nanotechnology, bioeconomy or the reuse of CO2 as a chemical feedstock. But I would like to understand from the Commission how they are seeing the way forward or how they expect the EU legislation and its implementation to facilitate really and truly and in a concrete manner a new alliance between chemicals, agriculture and waste, first and foremost to offer new business opportunities in the green economy, but also to help make the concept of the circular economy a reality. It is something that we have been working for and it is something where EU legislation can truly contribute and make sure that we have a situation where the circular economy takes into account the chemicals industry and is something that is beneficial for our citizens across the EU.
Thank you very much. Madame Rivasi.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Chairman. Well, I've got a whole series of questions because I was on the Pesticides Committee in the previous legislature, and this was on a risk assessment on chemical substances. Now, I was shocked quite a lot by something this summer. That was that EFSA, our food safety agency, made a proposal on a risk assessment for pesticides regarding bees in particular, and they took into account chronic toxicity, in particular, of pesticides over time on both larvae and the bees. Well, the states rejected that in order to minimize the risk assessment with the Commission's complicity, because the Commission had made a proposal that was much lighter. I'd like to get your opinion on that, because that really does illustrate the chemicals and their assessment. I mean, if we carry on like this, we won't have any bees at all. On endocrine disruptors, the French health agency assessed this based on the population. There's a strong involvement of 6 endocrine disruptors. You can see, therefore, that our European regulation is not pertinent, because we know that these disruptors have health consequences, and everyone has them, because they're not just in food, they're not just in consumer goods, they're everywhere. So that means that we are not being rigorous enough to ban these substances. There's something else we're concerned about, and I would like to see an improvement in the legislation. That's on consumer goods. Because when we talk about diapers for toddlers, we can't force industry to admit what's in them. When there was independent bodies who looked into this, we saw that there were pesticide residues, there were endocrine disruptors, so we've got to force that, be this on feminine hygiene products, on diapers, that there be a labeling requirement. And then on nanoparticles, they're everywhere now. They're in our foods, they're in medicines, they're in vaccines, they're everywhere, and we don't know anything about them. So I would really like the Commission to decide that we've got to legislate on nanoparticles. So either we have a nano REACH, when we say that we've improved REACH, well, remember what we said in the Pesticides Committee. We realized that REACH gave the registration. The industry put these chemical substances out into the environment, even if the dossier wasn't complete. There again, we've got to change this. We don't authorize, we don't record them unless all of the dossiers are complete from industry. We've got huge gaps in the system because you're too lax, you're too nice to the industry. So there's things that need to be changed. And I think that in terms of the Commission and in the Parliament, we are not hard-nosed enough. We're talking about the environment. We're all affected by this, and we're all dying little by little of the cancer epidemic.
Après, Madame Trier-Lenoir, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, thank you to the Bureau of the Committee for putting this important subject on the agenda, and thank you to the Commission for their explanations. Perhaps a bit of a provocative comment. You mentioned your concerns with regard to the industry's hesitations, on which my colleague Michel Rivasi commented, and you also expressed your fears about the isolated initiatives from member states. When you referred to the stakeholders, you referred to governments, industry, and stakeholders beyond the EU. There is one category of people who are able to weigh heavily on industries through their credit cards and on governments by their vote. That's the consumers. As my colleague Peter Lieser said, legislation can be a binary approach, authorization or ban, but it can and should also be made up of information to the main people involved, and that's the consumers and consumer associations. Our pleading for a labeling system along the lines of the Nutri-Score, which they quite rapidly accepted, and which allows us to have information and the public can make decisions based on this about the products they use. My question is, are the European consumer associations active enough in the legislative process to make them pertinent? And have you considered setting up a true system for informing consumers using a score or a labeling approach on the products they use?
Okay, we have 3 speakers who have asked a question in the previous round. I'm going to suggest that if you could keep your questions short, that will give our Commission colleagues sufficient time to answer. Please, Crystal.
Thanks. I will do it very short. First of all, I asked about fast-track procedure when we find dangerous substances. Would you will you recommend us in EU to make a fast-track procedure when we find dangerous substances, individual dangerous substances? I think that could be helpful because it's very complicated to change a whole range of, a whole set of legislation. Second, I'm not sure that I got your message. Will you or will you not stop the Danish government from banning some of these food contact material substances that are migrating into the food? I would like to know that because it's very important. It is the fluoride substances they are trying to ban, and I think it's a good idea since EU is not fast enough on this.
Thank you. Ms. Paulus.
Yes, it's very sure too. I do have to insist on the strategy of non-toxic environment, which was outlined in the 7th Environmental Action Plan as legal requirement. And you're just postponing, and I don't see how postponing will bring us further in ensuring a healthy environment for also people as well as biodiversity. Also, there has been some prolonged discourse about REACH, which is not our subject today, actually, but all the other things which I was just talking about, I was asking for action, not for, well, we will see what the next Commission does. You have spent 4 years scrutinizing all those things, combination effects, endocrine disruptors, inconsistencies in risk management decisions, and you don't have any proposals on which action Commission will take. And I find that pretty, how could I just put it without being rude, but I do expect from Commission to do its job.
Thank you. You were the epitome of politeness. Ms. Hazelkamp, please.
Ja, dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, Chairman. I wanted to thank the Commission for the answers, but they're still being very vague. One answer on the general chromium 6. Well, that is the problem. Industry finds new legislation excessive, and they lobby strongly against it. The positions are divided. And that's precisely why it's so important that we listen to independent researchers, and not people that, because of political conviction or other reasons, are not independent. I want to ask the Commission, do you agree with the Pesticides Committee? If in the refit there are strong changes necessary, what exactly are you going to do and when?
Finally, Jutta Jutteland.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Commission for the answers. But I must agree with colleagues who say that some of the answers were not clear enough because of the serious situation that we face here. And I want to repeat not only what was mentioned by my colleague, that we need to see the long overdue EU strategy for a non-toxic environment. We have waited so long, it's long overdue, and it's not serious that we don't see it presented. And it's really in disrespect to the citizens that needs to know that we take serious their health and the environment protection. And then I also need to highlight the serious situation when it comes to the endocrine disruptors. We have studies that show link to serious diseases and problems with fertility in our member states. And I recently met a professor who talked about the situation where they studied pregnant women and they checked their body during the pregnancy, and the women with higher levels of chemicals with endocrine disrupting for endocrine disruptors, they actually also have problem with the baby's health when they are born. They can see the link. So this is something that we need to protect the citizens from, and for the future generation, this is really something that we will be, people will judge how we behaved, if we protected the babies or not. So I want to see that the Commission delivers not only one area for endocrine disruptors, but all the society. And we need protection in water, in drinking water, in cosmetics, in plastics, in all the daily life that we experience. So please, I want more answers. How will you act when it comes to endocrine disruptors?
Thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues. I'm going to give the floor to the Commission to answer. Obviously, you've heard a lot of concern from colleagues here in this committee. This is an issue of fundamental trust for citizens, of course, to have the confidence in the products they buy and the foods they eat and the water they drink and the exposure to chemicals in the environment that they live in. So I would stress, please do try and answer all of my colleagues' questions as best you can. I appreciate time is short. I know it's difficult. Obviously, you've given relatively comprehensive answers in the first round, but I would stress, obviously, if colleagues leave this committee with a sense that there are hanging threads that still have to be dealt with, we don't want to just wait until the new Commission takes office. We want to be sure that there is action being taken. So please, if I can give the floor to the Commission.
Yes, thanks. Before, I would like to make a general consideration. It's not that we don't want to be clear, but the issue is that we cannot anticipate what will be the program of the next Commission, because for the time being, we have only a president elected. In the political guidelines of the president elected, the issue of environment protection of citizens have a prominent part, because we have the European Green Deal that focuses not only on climate but also on the environment. We have other chapters as protecting a European way of life, protecting people. So All these is already in the guidelines, but these are just guidelines. This is not a working program. So for having a working program, for saying what the Commission will do, we need that before there is a commission that is designated. After the commission will take office the 1st of November, hopefully, and after we can decide and we can commit on what will be done. For the time being, it's completely impossible for us to say exactly what the Commission will do if we don't know who will be the Commission and if there is not a working program. Anyway, I will try to give more clarification on some questions. First of all, to Mrs. Dalli about the industry. There is still a lot to do on the circular economy, but I think that the work that we have done in the last 5 years is already enormous. 5 years ago, there was a lot of people that even do not know what means circular economy. Under this commission, it has been done an enormous work. As example, we can think about the plastics. For the plastics, there has been a strategy, an initiative. There has been a legislation, the directive on the single-use plastics and about plastic bottles. That is one of the main concerns for the environment, and they will become not anymore waste, but they will become secondary raw materials. In the framework of the circular economy, under this commission, there has been the communication on the end of waste criteria, from waste to secondary raw materials. So a lot of work has been done, but not everything can be done in 5 years. So this is clearly a priority that is already in the political guidelines of the president elected to continue this work on the circular economy. Concerning the very specific question about the procedure for bakery papers in Denmark, frankly speaking, I don't know where we are for this procedure, if there is a notification from Denmark for obtaining a derogation or if there is not. But these are cases that there are hundreds of cases like these in the Commission, and there is a well-established procedure. But I am not aware of this specific case. Et maintenant, je passe à la question qui a été formulée en français.
Now on to the question put in French on labeling for foodstuffs. The Commission has been working for a long time now on labeling for foodstuffs. In Europe, we have very detailed information already, amongst the most advanced in the world, but perhaps what we're missing is a bit of a summary. We have all of the foodstuffs and the ingredients, but we're missing a summary. The Nutri-Score is one of the proposals that's on the table. Our colleagues from DG Santé have already done a study on this. There are different options on the table, not just the Nutri-Score. So I think, once again, it will be up to the new Commission to reach some conclusions on this study, and if deems necessary to create a legislative proposal, it's up to them to decide in which way. Now, again, I can't anticipate what will happen afterwards, but there is a whole lot of work on the background that has been done and over the last few months, and I would expect that the next Commission already has the necessary information to complete this work quickly, and I'll give the floor to my colleague.
Also, rather briefly, I owed also the answer on the waste that was asked before in the previous round. I can only say that the new laws on the waste classification and on the definitions have come into force last year. They still have to be transposed by the member states, and once it's transposed, there will be a lot more clarity on what is this, what is not, what is hazardous waste, what is not. So we have to enforce that legislation. We have to make sure that everybody is doing the right thing, but it's a new law which still has not fully been transposed by the member states, just because there is still time to do it. As regards the Commission being lenient towards pollinators and the declining population of bees, I would like to probably redirect that question again to our colleagues in the health department who are responsible for this, but they only can confirm that indeed there is an alarming decline of the pollinators population in Europe, and it poses an enormous problem, not only for environment, but also for agriculture and for the entire population. So certainly there will have to be action, and the situation is pretty urgent and dire. lastly, as for, well, probably two more questions. One on nanomaterials was also mentioned by Madame Rivasi. The change of the requirements under the REACH for the registration of substances in nanoforms has just come into force. It's brand new legal requirement which clarifies which nanoforms and in what way they need to be registered under the REACH regulation. And that will really give a lot more information about where nanomaterials are, who they are, and that will also trigger analysis of their properties and if they are dangerous to health and environment or not, in what way. And that will allow us also to act on risk management. On endocrines, these are mentioned by President-elect as one of the topics where she wants to act. This commission adopted a strategy for endocrine disruptors already last year, and there is action ongoing. One of them is a cross-cutting fitness check of all legislation to see where endocrines are addressed, where they are not, or where they should be. Is there consistency? Is there logic into legal intervention? And that result will be very important because it could lead to the changes in the legislation, but we have to wait for that result. In the meantime, we will also be launching a new platform on endocrine disruptors where all the information will be available there. So there will be really a one-stop shop place for everybody who wants to know anything about endocrine disruptors, including studies, the best knowledge that we have. So that will really inform lots of decision making. And we will also be launching a forum with scientists, with various stakeholders, also rather soon in the coming months on endocrine disruptors in order to take forward that discussion and to inform also the fitness check, which, as I said, could eventually lead to legal changes. Thank you.
Thank you. As aware, obviously, of the constraints that you're under and very appreciative of the answers that you've given, nonetheless, obviously, we take note of what you've said. We take note of the promises and priorities that Frau von der Leyen has made in terms of her commitments. Obviously, we will take note of our concerns going forward and the answers you've given in terms of the Commissioner hearings that we will be attending. All I would say is that we do often have a situation, I think, where we find between mandates the outgoing Commission often feels as if it's unable to act in the final year or so of its mandate, preferring to delay until the next mandate. We then, of course, have a period where assessments are undertaken and action often doesn't take place until halfway through the next legislature. And the issues that citizens face simply don't have the luxury of conforming to the parliamentary and Commission timetable that we have. And I think that there has to be a way of making sure that the concerns and issues that we are raising here don't get lost in the transition between Commission mandates. It's my little spiel. Thank you very much. I appreciate it's a tough gig sometimes appearing before the committee, but we're very appreciative of your time and your answers today. And thank you very much for your time.